Imagine having it all. A thriving business, a loving family, and a picture-perfect life. Now, imagine losing everything in the blink of an eye because of betrayal. Not just any betrayal, but one so devastating it destroys your marriage, your career, and even your relationship with your child. What would you do? Today, I'm sharing the shocking story of how my life was turned upside down. And the ending of this tale? That's for you to decide. My name is Jack Carter. On paper, my life seemed perfect. I owned a successful chain of hardware stores across California, lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs, and had a family that others envied. My wife, Emily, was stunning and intelligent. She had left her corporate job years ago to help raise our son, Andy, but recently, she had taken a new position at an up-and-coming tech firm. Andy was a typical 15-year-old, a mix of teenage angst and a desire to impress me. For years, I believed we had the kind of marriage that would weather any storm. Emily and I had been through plenty together. Financial struggles when I first started my business, late nights nursing Andy through sickness, and even a few years of trying to find ourselves as we balanced work and family. Through it all, we had each other, or so I thought. In hindsight, the cracks had been forming long before I noticed them. Emily seemed distant lately. She worked late almost every night, and even when she was home, she seemed more engaged with her phone or laptop than with me or Andy. I chalked it up to the stress of her new job. She had landed a position as a project manager under Richard Collins, a wealthy and charismatic CEO. I was proud of her, though I missed the easy connection we used to share. Little did I know, those long hours at the office weren't entirely spent on spreadsheets and presentations. Our relationship had changed. I don't know when it started, but I could feel the distance like a wall between us. Conversations became shorter, more transactional. We no longer shared lazy mornings over coffee, discussing plans for the day. Emily seemed preoccupied, always glancing at her phone, and when I asked her about work, she'd give vague, clipped responses. I told myself it was normal. People grow apart sometimes, especially after years of marriage. But a part of me worried. I even thought about asking her directly if something was wrong, but I hesitated. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Andy had noticed it too. One evening, as I sat in my home office going over invoices, he wandered in and sat across from me. "Dad," he said, his voice hesitant. "Is Mom okay?" I put down my pen and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "She just seems different," he said. "Like she's not here even when she is." His words struck a chord. "It's probably work, buddy," I said, forcing a smile. "She's just busy." Andy didn't look convinced, and truthfully, neither was I. It was a Saturday afternoon when Andy came to me with a look on his face I'd never forget. He was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line, and his hands fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie. "Dad, I saw something," he said, his voice shaky. I put down the wrench I'd been using to fix the lawnmower and gave him my full attention. "What is it, son?" I saw Mom yesterday. After school," he began, glancing down at the floor. "She wasn't alone." "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest tightening. "I was at the mall with some friends, and we saw her. She was with a man, her boss, I think. They were in this restaurant, sitting really close, and, Dad, she kissed him." The words hit me like a freight train. I stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. "Are you sure?" I finally asked. He nodded. "Yeah, it was her." I didn't know what to do, so I didn't say anything then. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of mistake, that Andy had misunderstood or misinterpreted what he saw. But deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed next to Emily, who was sound asleep, her breathing steady. My mind replayed Andy's words over and over. By morning, I decided I needed to find out for myself. Over the next week, I began paying closer attention to Emily's behavior. I noticed the way she smiled at her phone when she thought no one was looking, the vague excuses about why she needed to stay late at work, and the way she avoided looking me in the eye when I asked about her day. One evening, while she was in the shower, I picked up her phone. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages. Most were innocent conversations with friends or coworkers. But then I saw a thread with a contact saved simply as R. My stomach dropped as I read the messages. They were flirtatious at first, then downright explicit. My blood boiled as I saw her making plans to meet him, Richard, at his penthouse. There were photos too, ones I couldn't unsee. I put the phone down and sat there in stunned silence. The truth was undeniable now. Emily, the woman I had loved for nearly 2 decades, was cheating on me. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cold cup of coffee. My thoughts were in chaos, replaying every happy memory Emily and I had shared, now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. She walked into the kitchen wearing her usual calm smile, the one that now felt like a mask hiding the lies underneath. "Morning, Jack," she said cheerfully, pouring herself a cup of coffee. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Emily, we need to talk," I said, my voice colder than I intended. She paused, her back to me, before slowly turning around. "What's wrong?" she asked, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "Fear, perhaps?" "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't pretend you don't know. I found the messages, Emily. I know about you and Richard." Her face went pale, the coffee mug shaking in her hand. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and the silence between us felt like it could crush me. Finally, she set the mug down and crossed her arms. "So what now?" she said, her voice trembling but defiant. That response hit me harder than I expected. No apology, no denial, just a question. "What now?" I repeated bitterly. "You've been lying to me, cheating on me with your boss, and that's all you have to say?" She exhaled sharply and sat down across from me. "Jack, I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I felt so alone. You've been so focused on your business, your work. I felt invisible." Invisible. I nearly laughed, but it came out as a bitter scoff. "Emily, I've been building this business for us, for our family. Every late night, every deal, every sacrifice was for you and Andy. And this is how you repay me." She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I didn't plan this, Jack. It just happened. Richard. He made me feel alive again." The words stung like knives. I stood up, pacing the room. "Alive? And what about our family? What about me? Did you think about how this would destroy everything we've built?" Emily's silence was deafening. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough." It didn't even scratch the surface of what I needed to hear. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for hours, my thoughts spiraling out of control. How had it come to this? Emily had been my partner, my confidant, the love of my life. Now she felt like a stranger. The image of her with Richard haunted me, and every time I thought of Andy, my heart broke. How could I face him, knowing his mother had betrayed us both? By the time I returned home, it was late. The house was quiet, the lights in the living room dimmed. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sympathy, but it quickly turned to anger. "We can't keep living like this," I said, breaking the silence. "This marriage, it's over." She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "Jack, please don't do this. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. For Andy." I shook my head. "Don't use Andy as an excuse. You made your choice, Emily, and now I'm making mine." The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and endless arguments. Emily fought hard for the house, for custody of Andy, and even for a share of my business. I couldn't believe the lengths she was willing to go to. Every conversation turned into a battle, and every battle left me more drained. Andy tried to stay out of it, but the tension in the house was impossible to ignore. One evening, as I was packing my things to move out, he came to my room. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you and Mom going to be okay?" I looked at him, my heart breaking for the 1,000th time. "I don't know, buddy," I admitted, "but I promise you this. No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Emily's betrayal didn't end with her affair. She wanted revenge for what she saw as years of neglect, and she wasn't going to let me walk away unscathed. Through her connection with Richard, she hired one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state. The strategy was clear: destroy me. The court battles were brutal. Emily painted me as a workaholic who had neglected his family, while her lawyer spun a sob story of how she had been driven to her affair by my supposed emotional absence. I sat in the courtroom, listening to lies about myself and our marriage, feeling helpless to fight back. But the worst part was how it affected Andy. He was forced to testify about his experiences at home, and I could see the guilt eating him alive. He blamed himself for everything, convinced that telling me about Emily's affair had set this nightmare in motion. "Dad," he said one night, tears streaming down his face, "I'm so sorry. I should have kept my mouth shut." I hugged him tightly. "Andy, none of this is your fault. You did the right thing. What's happening between your mom and me? That's on us, not you." Despite my assurances, the damage was done. Andy became withdrawn, his once bright and cheerful demeanor replaced by a sullen silence. Killed me to see him like that, knowing I couldn't fix it. Divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a war. I underestimated Emily, and even more so, I underestimated the lengths Richard would go to for her. With his resources and connections, she had the upper hand in every legal battle we fought. First, it was the house. Despite the fact that I had bought it long before Emily and I married, she claimed it was our family home and argued she needed it for Andy's sake. Her lawyers spun a story about how moving would destabilize him during an already tumultuous time. I could see through her motives. She wanted the house not for Andy, but to take something from me. The judge sided with her. Then came the business. This was my breaking point. My hardware chain wasn't just a livelihood. It was my passion, something I had built from the ground up through years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Emily claimed she had supported me during its early days, which technically wasn't untrue, but her role was minimal. Yet, with Richard's influence, she managed to secure a significant share of my company in the divorce settlement. What I didn't know was that she had no intention of keeping her stake. Within weeks of the ruling, she sold her shares to a competitor, one who had been trying to buy me out for years. This blindsided me, as the sale gave them controlling interest in the company. Suddenly, I was no longer the owner of my own business. I tried to fight back, but the legal fees were draining me dry. Richard's involvement only made things worse. He had connections in the corporate world, and soon, rumors about my supposed financial instability began spreading. Contracts were canceled, partnerships dissolved, and my reputation was in shambles. The final blow came when I was forced to step down as CEO. The company I had poured my life into was no longer mine, and I was left with nothing but the scraps. I couldn't even look at Emily during our final court hearing. The woman I had once loved had become a stranger, someone capable of destroying everything I had worked for. Losing the company wasn't just a financial hit. It was a blow to my identity. For years, I had been Jack Carter, successful entrepreneur, provider, and family man. Now, I was none of those things. I moved into a dingy one-bedroom apartment in the city, far from the suburban comfort I had once known. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors arguing through the night. The kitchen was barely big enough to hold a microwave and a mini fridge, but it didn't matter. I had no appetite anyway. My days became a blur. I spent hours staring at the walls, replaying every mistake I had made, wondering where it had all gone wrong. I stopped answering calls from friends and family, too ashamed to admit how far I had fallen. Even Andy stopped reaching out, though I couldn't blame him. I had become a shadow of the father he once admired. One night, I sat on the edge of my bed, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a stack of unpaid bills in the other. The weight of it all felt unbearable. I thought about ending it right there, letting the pain swallow me whole. But then I saw Andy's face in my mind. Not the sullen teenager I had seen in court, but the little boy who used to sit on my shoulders and laugh like the world was perfect. I couldn't do that to him. So, I put the bottle down and made a decision. If I was going to rebuild my life, I had to start now. Starting over wasn't easy. My name had been dragged through the mud in the business world, and finding work was nearly impossible. No one wanted to hire a disgraced entrepreneur with a ruined reputation. I eventually took a job at a small hardware store downtown, the kind of place I used to compete against. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I swallowed my pride and focused on doing the work. I needed the money, and more than that, I needed to feel useful again. The store was owned by an older man named Frank, who had run the business for decades. He didn't care about my past. All he saw was a man willing to work hard. Everyone deserves a second chance, he told me one day as we unloaded a shipment of tools. What you do with it is up to you. His words stuck with me. I started putting in extra hours, learning every aspect of the business and even helping Frank modernize his operations. Slowly, I began to feel a flicker of hope. But redemption wasn't just about work. I needed to rebuild my relationship with Andy. I reached out to him asking if we could meet. At first, he was hesitant, but eventually he agreed. When we met at a diner near his school, he looked older, more serious. The boyish spark in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something more guarded. "Andy," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I know I've let you down, and I'm sorry. I want to make things right." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "I just want my dad back," he said quietly. Those words broke me, but they also gave me purpose. Rebuilding my relationship with Andy became my top priority. After our meeting at the diner, I made a point to call him every day, even if just to ask about school or his favorite video games. At first, the conversations were brief and awkward, but over time he began to open up. He told me about his soccer games, his favorite classes, and even the girl he had a crush on. Hearing him talk like a normal teenager again felt like a small victory. One Saturday, I picked him up for a trip to the lake where we used to fish. It had been years since we'd gone, and I wasn't sure if he'd even be interested. To my surprise, he smiled when I brought it up. "I still have my old tackle box," he said, and for the first time in months, I saw a spark of excitement in his eyes. The drive to the lake was quiet at first, but as we set up our fishing rods, Andy began to ask questions. "Dad, do you miss Mom?" he asked, staring out at the water. I took a deep breath, considering my answer. "I miss the person she used to be," I said honestly. "But sometimes people change, and it's not always for the better." He nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I don't understand why she did it," he said. "I thought we were a happy family." "So did I admitted. "But her choices don't define us, Andy. We're still a family, you and me. That hasn't changed." He didn't say anything, but he gave me a small nod, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were on the same page. As I focused on rebuilding my life, Emily wasn't done with hers. Through the grapevine, I heard that her relationship with Richard was thriving. They were seen at galas, charity events, and high-profile dinners, flaunting their newfound power couple status. It disgusted me, but I tried to let it go. She wasn't my problem anymore. That changed when she started interfering in my attempts to reconnect with Andy. One evening, Andy called me, his voice tense. "Dad, Mom's saying some things about you," he said. "What kind of things?" I asked, my heart sinking. "She says you're trying to turn me against her," he said, "and that you're bitter because she's happy now." I clenched my jaw, anger boiling under the surface. "Andy, that's not true," I said firmly. "I'd never use you like that. All I want is to be your dad and spend time with you." He hesitated. "I know, but it's hard when she keeps saying stuff." I knew then that Emily wasn't just trying to move on. She was trying to erase me from Andy's life. I couldn't let that happen. I filed for shared custody, determined to protect my relationship with my son. The court battle was grueling. Emily argued that I was unstable due to my financial losses and the stress of losing my business. She presented emails and text messages taken out of context, painting me as an angry and bitter man. But I had one thing she didn't: Andy. When he testified, he told the court he wanted to spend time with both of us. His words carried weight, and the judge granted us shared custody. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough. Life after the custody battle felt like stepping into the sunlight after a long storm. I had Andy with me every other weekend and on Wednesdays after school. We made the most of our time together, playing basketball at the park, cooking disastrous meals in my tiny kitchen, and watching old action movies. At work, things were improving too. Frank decided to retire and offered to sell me the hardware store. It wasn't the empire I'd once built, but it was a fresh start, and I grabbed it with both hands. I poured everything I had into the store, turning it into a thriving business. Customers appreciated the personal touch I brought, and soon, I was starting to regain my confidence. One evening, Andy helped me paint a new sign for the store. As we worked, he looked at me and said, "You're happier now, Dad." I paused, his words sinking in. He was right. For the first time in years, I felt free. While I was rebuilding, Emily's life was beginning to unravel. Her relationship with Richard, once picture-perfect, began to crack under the weight of public scrutiny and power struggles. Richard's reputation as a ruthless businessman caught up with him, and soon, his company was embroiled in a scandal. Emily tried to distance herself, but her association with him made her a target. The media turned on her, painting her as a gold digger who had betrayed her family for wealth and status. It was a harsh narrative, but one she couldn't escape. Andy began to see her differently too. "Mom's always on the phone trying to fix things," he told me one night. "She doesn't have time for me anymore." I felt a pang of sympathy for Emily, but it was quickly overshadowed by the need to protect Andy. "I'm here for you," I said, "no matter what happens." Months turned into years. Andy grew taller, stronger, and more independent. He started calling my store his second home, helping out on weekends and learning the value of hard work. Emily faded from our lives, her once bright image tarnished by her choices. Occasionally, I'd hear from mutual acquaintances about her struggles, but I didn't dwell on it. My focus was on the future. One evening, as Andy and I locked up the store, he turned to me with a smile. "You did it, Dad," he said. "Did what?" I asked. "You started over," he said, "and you're better than ever." His words stayed with me as we drove home, the open road stretching out before us. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't define me. My story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Sometimes, life brings us to rock bottom, and it feels like there's no way out. But is there always a chance to start over? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you fight to rebuild what was lost, or let the past go and move on? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.